fascinating topic. He's really good. His treatise on this, which is a part of the Summa Theologiae, is very short, but there's just so much packed into it. Well, in preparing for one chapter, I just thought, I wonder what people in general think about this stuff. I always include a little introduction that's aimed at ordinary readers and addresses the contemporary culture before I started talking about what Thomas Aquinas is teaching. So I did a quick web search using the question, what can we do to be happy? What can we do to be happy? The first time I ran the search, the query yielded 627 million hits. Now, I guess the algorithm learns, because each time after that I ran it, I got fewer. But 627 million. Ironically, the first search result after the advertisements was a suicide hotline. Now that tells you something, I think, about the way in which many people are trying to find out about happiness. It's because they're desperately unhappy. Well, a lot of these websites, I checked some of them out, a lot of the advice was plain wrong. Some of it boiled down to try to have good luck. I'm quite serious. Try to have good luck. It would help if you're wealthy, they say, and if you never get sick and so forth. Well, a lot of it was about the banishing of sorrow, and not all of their advice about the banishing of sorrow is bad. But you know, to be happy is not the same as just not suffering. It's not the same as just not suffering. It's surprising to me how difficult it is for some people to get the idea that happiness is a positive quality. It's not just the absence of suffering. I run through a certain exercise with my undergraduates, and I ran through it with some freshmen whom I don't usually teach a couple of years ago, and I said, so what do you think happiness is? This is something that Aristotle did. And he got certain answers from people, certain common answers that people tend to give today too. And then he cross-examined the answers. He used things that they knew to cross-examine things that they thought they knew. Some things that they thought they knew to cross-examine other things that they thought they knew. So I do this with my students, and I did it with them. And I said, so what do you think happiness is? I was expecting them to say things like this. Well, happiness is pleasure. Happiness is people liking you. Happiness is love. Happiness is having money. The first 6 answers all were variations on happiness is nothing but the absence of pain. Now, there must be an awful lot of suffering in these young lives for them to be giving answers like that. And I was working the audience, okay? I was saying, wait, you're telling me what it isn't. What is it? What is the positive element? And then somebody would go like this and give another variation on absence of pain. It was extremely difficult. Well, back to the web search. I got other interesting tips there too. Some of the advice was simply fatuous. My favorite was, happiness is maximized at 13.9 degrees centigrade. The person was entirely serious and claimed that this was backed up by research. It may be true that people are least uncomfortable at that temperature, but that's a funny idea of what happiness is. Well, let's see what Thomas Aquinas himself says about happiness. Or, no, let's not yet talk about what Thomas Aquinas says about happiness. I don't know if you know this, but happiness is a fad now. What I mean by happiness being a fad is happiness research. It's a huge topic in the social sciences now. There's a whole new school of psychology called positive psychology that claims to be studying this. Among social scientists, though, the usual method of studying happiness isn't a lot different than what I was doing with my students that day. They ask people, are you happy? And then if they say, yeah, well, I guess I am, then they say, well, what makes you happy? Now, and the supposition behind that seems to be that people know what happiness is, that they understand themselves that well. Is that a reasonable assumption? I think people must know something. But do they really know what happiness is? it seems that it's unlikely that you would have 627 million hits to the question, what makes you happy, if people knew. And consider, if people don't possess that consummate fulfillment which leaves nothing further to be desired, then they're not going to know the answer to the researcher's questions. Or they may think happiness lies in all the things that they want but don't have. I'm not happy now, but it's because I don't have those things. And if I had them, then I would be happy. Now, even if those things are empty, they may think that. Or they may try to convince themselves that they are happy, even though they aren't. I mentioned this freshman class to you, where the students all gave variations on the answer, happiness is nothing but the absence of pain, which suggests to me that they're in great suffering. And yet on their mid-semester course instructor surveys, they were saying things like, I am having an awesome life. I don't know how you combine the self-description, I am having an awesome life, with the indirect evidence of tears, of suffering. Well, Thomas Aquinas' method is different. He doesn't ignore what people say about happiness. In fact, he takes it quite seriously, but his method is different. Instead of simply surveying people and counting up their answers, instead of following the majority view, St. Thomas undertakes a philosophical analysis of happiness. Now, what is a philosophical analysis? That doesn't mean thinking that common opinions are useless. The classical approach to philosophy, as a matter of fact, always began with common opinion. It began there. Where else is there to start? You've got to start somewhere. We have to know something, or we couldn't even be aware of the fact that we don't know much, you know? But besides, common resources, I hinted at this earlier, often provides the resources to correct itself or interrogate itself if you give it a little help. Suppose that somebody says, well, happiness lies in being respected. That's a common opinion today. It was a common opinion way back in Aristotle's day. The answer that what they said was honor, which is a near equivalent of respect. Suppose that somebody says happiness lies in being respected. Well, ask this person, oh, really? Well, do you think that you would be happy if you were respected for qualities that people thought you had, but that you knew you didn't have? Most people, I won't say everybody, most people say, well, no, that would be kind of empty, that would be hollow, I wouldn't be happy then. And so then you see, one thing that they know has shown them the fallacy of something else that they thought they knew. And you can say, well then it looks like being respected by others isn't what you really think happiness is. It looks like it might be closer to having the qualities that would make you deserve to be respected. You think so? And people say, oh yeah, well, that's not the whole answer to what happiness is, but it explains what I mean by using the resources of common experience to interrogate common experience and try to sniff out its errors and to put it on a better path. Now, when you look at things like this, why do people say that respect is the meaning of happiness? Well, it's a wrong answer, but there's a grain of truth, isn't it? Because it does have something to do with having the qualities that deserve respect. People say, well, I think that money will make me happy. That's a false answer, but there's a grain of truth in it, because if we didn't have any material resources and we're starving, of course we would be unhappy, right? People say, oh, I think being liked, I think pleasure. Well, that's the wrong answer too, but you know, if you didn't have any pleasure whatsoever, it would be, if you were just in there is a psychological state. People in depression often experience this. It's called anhedonia, non-pleasureness, to trace out the roots of the word. And it's a miserable condition to be in. A person might not be feeling actual pain, but the sheer absence of any pleasure whatsoever, the inability to take pleasure in anything at all, is in itself a kind of suffering. So No. Is happiness the same thing as pleasure? No, it isn't. But you can see why people would get confused. Because the happy person is certainly having some pleasurable experiences, and that's something that needs analysis. And, Thomas Aquinas takes all this kind of thing seriously. Now, after going as far as he can with philosophy, St. Thomas draws on a source of additional data. A source of additional data, and that is revelation. Sometimes people say, now you're leaving reason, you're going to faith. But Thomas Aquinas doesn't think that faith is unreasonable. It's extra data for reason to work with. It's extra data that it couldn't have come up with on its own. It's provided by God. But even then, you don't just say, I believe it because I believe it because I believe it. You have good reasons to believe that this revelation from God is authentic. When we believe in Scripture, if somebody says, well, why do you believe that this Jesus was really resurrected from the dead? You just want to believe that? And you say, no, we had, there was the empty tomb. There was the fact that Roman soldiers were guarding it. Roman soldiers were not the sort who ran away normally. All the other explanations of what happened here seem to be defective. Jesus was seen after his resurrection. He was plainly dead before he was put in the tomb. Many witnesses saw him, and they were reliable witnesses. In the Gospels, you read that they even say, many of whom are still alive. The point being, you can interrogate them if you want to. So, just like if somebody came back from China and said, you couldn't work out by philosophical analysis, there must be a wall in China. But if this is a reliable witness, you believe it, okay? So also, we have reasons to believe in revelation. I'm not saying that just working out theorems on a blackboard is going to get you to faith. It isn't. Faith is a gift. Even if you have good reasons to believe something, it doesn't follow that you will believe it. Correct? I mean, for instance, let's suppose that I'm on the second floor of a burning building, and I don't know how I'm going to get out of here. The staircase is on fire. I've shut my door. I've got damp towels in the crack there so smoke won't come in. And I fling open the window, and I'm just thinking, what am I going to do? I'm 3 stories up. I don't want to jump. And then I hear a voice. I can't even see the ground. There's too much smoke. But I hear a voice coming up from below. You up there on the 3rd floor. We've got a net. Jump. We'll get you. And I say, I'm afraid, I can't see you. And the voice says, that doesn't matter. We can see you. Now, do I have good reason to jump? Yes. And yet, jumping is still an act of faith. I might not be able to work myself up into assenting to these good reasons. And actually jumping to be caught. It's like that with being caught by God when we leap from the burning house of sin. So there is good reason to believe in revelation, although it isn't philosophy. It's not unreasonable, but it isn't like working out theorems. So after going as far as he can with philosophy, St. Thomas draws on revelation. He draws on the Bible. He draws on the sacred tradition. And so his analysis then is not only philosophical, it's theological. You with me so far? Now I want to ask the question, is there an ultimate purpose in everything that we do? Thomas Aquinas thinks that there are reasons for things. And I don't just mean reasons for things like the striking of the table by my foot caused a noise. But I mean reasons for things like the reason Budziszewski kicked the table was that he wanted to make a point. In other words, there are purposes, right? An ordinary efficient cause is like a push. It makes something happen. But a goal, a purpose, is something that's pulling. It's that for the sake of which you do things. And we can ask the question, is there something for the sake of which we do everything? Is there an ultimate purpose that's somehow built into us? You know, you might think, well, sure, we'd know it if there was. Well, we might not. There are lots of things we don't know about ourselves. Sometimes we can figure them out if we think about it, though. Is there a purpose? There are certainly little purposes in things that we do. I'll ask my students sometimes, what was the first thing that you did this morning when you got up? A student might say, well, I brushed my teeth. And I say, well, okay, did you just brush them, or did you have a purpose in mind? Was there some end that you were seeking? Were you brushing them for the sake of something? And they say, well, yeah, I was brushing for the sake of getting them clean. And I'll say, well, why did you want them clean? Well, was that for the sake of something? And they'll say, well, sure, for the sake of, they might say health. They might say so that my breath isn't bad. And I'll say, why don't you care about whether your breath is bad? Well, because I don't want people to avoid me. Why don't you want people to avoid you? Because I want to have some friends, man. Why do you want friends? Well, I'd be unhappy without friends. And now you say, well, why do you want to be happy? Do you notice that you've reached the end of the road here? Nobody pursues happiness for the sake of something else. You may brush your teeth for the sake of something else. You may build a window in your house for the sake of something else. You may tie your shoes extra tight for the sake of something else. You may go back to school and get some degree for the sake of something else. But nobody seeks happiness for the sake of something else. So it looks like there is an ultimate purpose in everything that we seek. The word happiness in English is not a real good one because people think that happiness is pleasure. Right? Often they think that happiness is pleasure. Let's substitute some other words, like we want to be fulfilled, we want to flourish, we want to live well. Okay? So this is our purpose. We've got a name for it. Having a name for it doesn't tell us exactly what it is, does it? Aristotle had this problem, Thomas Aquinas has this problem, I have this problem, I'm not up to their level. But you say, well, okay, so we have a name for what we're seeking. It's happiness. But what is happiness? What does this fulfillment, what does this living well, what does this flourishing, what does it lie in? And this is where people start to disagree again. Now, Thomas Aquinas carefully investigates a lot of the things in which happiness is commonly thought to lie. For instance, does supreme fulfillment lie in external goods? Like wealth, like honor, you mentioned that, like fame. Fame is not the same as honor. It's everybody knows about you, that's fame. Honor, they give you an award or they tell you you're doing something good. You could even be famous for being wicked. Did you know, by the way, that some people have thought that it was a worthwhile end to pursue in life, even to be famous by being wicked? Machiavelli says, it's good if, he thinks that the great thing is to have so much glory, to become so well known that you'll be remembered after your death for generations. And it would be great if you can attain glory for being so good. But if it says if you can't be completely good, then at least you ought to be completely wicked. And I'm not kidding you, he actually says this. That's a mistake, but people have thought this. What about power? What about power? Could happiness lie in that? You might think, well, no. If I asked my students at UT, do you think happiness lies in power? None of them would say so. But in fact, in various ways, naturally, they seek power. They want to be able to exercise choices and have their choices taken seriously. They want to have degrees so that they have more freedom of action and they can do things. They want to be able to affect their environment. These are all power. It's not power in the sense necessarily of lording it over other people and being greedy for that domination. But, this is power. Does happiness lie in bodily goods? External goods we just covered. What about bodily goods? What about, for instance, health? I came across, when I was doing the research for my book on Thomas Aquinas, again, one of the little introductory sections, I said, does anybody think that happiness really lies just in health? And there was an autobiographical work that was written by a man who had been an alcoholic for many years. And he really seemed to think, partly from the misery of his experience when he was unhealthy and under the spell of alcohol, He said, when you've got your health, you've got everything. When you don't have your health, you have nothing. He really thought health is the answer to the question, what is happiness? Nothing but health. Does it lie in beauty? Many people go nuts trying to make themselves beautiful, or in the case of men, the form that takes is, exercising and trying to make themselves buff, right? So that everybody is going to think that they're really attractive. How does it lie in, we covered external goods like wealth. Does it lie in bodily goods like health and beauty? Does it lie in goods of the soul? That could mean experiences like pleasure, but it could also mean dispositions like virtue. That's an answer that it seems very moral and good to say, oh, happiness lies in virtue. But even that can't be the whole answer, can it? If you are a courageous person, what if you're a generous person but you have nothing to be generous with? Having enough to be able to give to your friends, to give to people who are needy, is a blessing, quite apart from your own needs. Aristotle called this the equipment of generosity. And the virtues need equipment. They aren't sufficient for a complete life by themselves. They need some opportunity to be exercised, or they're not going to be complete. So the answer virtue is better than most of those other answers that I just went down. But actually, all of these things are radically incomplete, and they ultimately let us down. You may become completely famous. You're a rock star. I don't know. You're at the pinnacle of fame. Everybody thinks that you're the cat's pajamas. My students find it very amusing when I use expressions like that. I sometimes shock them by using them also. That he's the bee's knees. That's even before my time. All of these things are radically incomplete. They ultimately let us down. I was just commenting on fame, but wealth can let you down. There's the parable in the Bible. The man. Why does Jesus say, "Blessed are the poor"? Is he saying you're supremely happy if you're destitute and starving? No. And yet blessedness means supreme happiness. What he means, I think, is if you don't have anything beyond what you need for the day, there's one good thing in this, brother. You're not going to be depending on your wealth and on your physical means and on things like that. You're not going to be putting false trust in them. The only thing you have left to trust in is God, and he's the only thing that deserves ultimate trust. That is a blessing. Okay? Now, but I was saying all of these things are ultimately let you down. Well, would you be happy then? Sometimes people think, yes, I see that you won't be happy just with beauty. I see you won't be happy just with wealth. I see you won't be happy just with health. I see you won't be happy just with fame. I see you won't be happy just with power. I see you won't be happy just with pleasure. But what if you have all of those things? What if you have a sufficiency of all of them? Then I'll be happy, right? Well, there's something to it. We're going to come to the respect in which there's something to that answer at the end of the talk. But it's still wrong, because you can have everything, as people say, he's got everything. You can have everything and still be saying every day of your life, is this all there is? Is this all there is? Isn't there anything more? What am I missing? There's something wrong with these answers. I can't go through all of them, but let's consider pleasure. As I mentioned, a lot of people think pleasure just is happiness. St. Thomas says, no, look. You can think of it this way. There is a pleasure center in the brain. Did you know that? If they drop a wire into the pleasure center of a rat's brain, and they connect it to a little switch, and if the rat presses down on the switch, he gets this jolt of pleasure. The rat will starve and die of thirst, pressing the lever, neglecting food and drink. Well, I ask my students who know all about the pleasure center for the brain. I ask my students sometimes, I say, well, okay, you say happiness is just pleasure. Suppose that we ran a wire into the pleasure center of your brain. And we put you in a hospital bed, hooked you up to a glucose drip, you know, and an IV, you know, make sure you got some vitamins in it so that you could have a nice long life, and you didn't have any actual experiences. You didn't go to school, you didn't get married, but you didn't have children, but you had as much pleasure as it is possible to have. Would this be a life worth living? Surprisingly, even here, a few people will answer yes. Most people are more sensible and say, well, no. It looks like I don't just want to get married for the sake of pleasure. Loving my wife, having her, and receiving her love is a good in itself, and it does give me pleasure. I don't just want the pleasure of knowledge. Rather, I want knowledge. And if I have knowledge, it gives me pleasure. Otherwise, you could say, what if we just gave you the illusion of knowledge and you had the pleasure of having knowledge without the knowledge? Would that be okay? And people don't actually find that satisfactory. So you see, pleasure isn't enough. Thomas Aquinas says, the way to think about that is that pleasure is not the good, but it is connected with what is good because it is the rest of the soul, the repose of the soul in something that is good. Okay? It is good to enjoy, to have a friendship and to practice that friendship. Well, when I rest in that friendship, I have pleasure. But it's not for the sake of the pleasure, it's just this crowning grace of this thing that is good in itself. Pleasure is not the good itself, it is the repose of the soul in something else that is good. The hedonist, unfortunately, doesn't have a clue as to what this good really is, this other good. He just wants to tickle the pleasure center of his brain. Well, Thomas Aquinas, after going through this long, long list, he has article after article. I don't know if you've read any parts of the Summa, but it's divided into parts, and the parts are divided into questions, and the questions are divided into articles. And the articles are short discussions with a lot of objections, and he replies to the objections, and he gives his own argument. And in a whole series of articles, he says, does pleasure lie in this? Does it lie in this? Not pleasure, happiness, supreme happiness. Does it lie in this? Does it lie in this? Does it lie in this? Now, he's not actually talking about the imperfect, fragmentary, incomplete thing that is often called happiness in this life. He sort of drops, it's a surprise, he sort of drops into the discussion later on that, you know, what the happiness of this life is, and you think, but you hadn't been talking about this, and he says, well, that's right, I've been talking about what supreme happiness is. And what passes for happiness in this life is not supreme happiness. So he says, so after going through all of these things, all of these created goods like wealth, created goods like health, created goods like knowledge, he says, well, does happiness lie in any created good? And he says, no. There is not a single thing in creation, in the created order, that can make you completely happy. There are plenty of things in the created order that are worth having. But you know, there's happiness here in two senses. Something can be worth having for its own sake, and yet not completely fulfilling. Something can be happiness in the sense that it is worth having for its own sake, not merely as a means to something else, and yet it still leaves you wanting something more. There are a lot of things like that in life, but is there anything that leaves you wanting nothing more? Your desire has been fully quieted. No. No. Now, here's a peculiarity. Aristotle, the pagan philosopher, Thomas Aquinas respects him very greatly, but he thinks that Aristotle missed some notes. Aristotle had said, nature, we're talking about human nature here. He says, God and nature make nothing in vain. What that means is that there's nothing in us that's for nothing. Everything in us is for something. I have legs. Well, I can walk. I have a heart so that I can pump blood and deliver oxygen and nourishment to my tissues. I have lungs so that I can take in that oxygen and the blood can be oxygenated. I have eyes so that I can see. I have desires so that they will lead me to things. Every desire is for the sake of its satisfaction. I desire friends. Well, there is such a thing as friends. Otherwise, the desire for friendship would be in vain. It would be for nothing, right? But there is nothing in us that is in vain. There is no deep longing in us that is for nothing. And yet, we do want complete happiness. And nothing in the created order satisfies it. If it's true that nothing in nature is in vain, and Aristotle doesn't quite figure this out, but Thomas Aquinas does, if it's true that nothing in nature is in vain, then that desire for complete fulfillment must not be in vain either. It must be that it is possible to satisfy it. Yet, he's just shown exhaustively that nothing in this life, nothing in the created order can satisfy it. It seems to follow that its satisfaction must lie in something that is beyond the created order. In that, and who would that be? That would be the Creator. All the goods in the created order he made. He is the unmade, the uncreated good, who is the source of all of those things, and all of those things merely reflect him and give us little glimpses of him. You know, often we don't look. It's important to recognize that if ultimate fulfillment doesn't lie in any created good, it's important to recognize that we should keep looking, because nothing in nature is in vain. But people don't keep looking. One day in class, this was a graduate seminar, I found out that the topic of ultimate fulfillment, the topic of complete happiness, can actually make people angry. Can make people angry. It comes too close to their hurts. A student argued, a young woman in class argued vigorously that the sole meaning of happiness is pleasure. Okay, well, that didn't surprise me. But there was an edge in her voice. And I gave a sort of, I said, well, isn't it true? You say that happiness is pleasure, but isn't it true that no matter how much pleasure you enjoy, it always leaves something to be desired? Isn't it true that no matter how much pleasure you enjoy, you keep asking at the end of it, is that all there is? She was angry. She said, the fact that we always want more is just the way it is. It's the way things are. And if we're disappointed, we just have to get over it. She was determined to pitch her tent on a plain of salt. She was determined to hitch her wagon to emptiness. It was as though she was saying, I will not be burned. I will not be moved. I will not be taken in by this hope for happiness. I've been burned too many times. Maybe that was what had been going on in her life. I often suspect something like that. Well, what kind of thing is happiness then? I've skipped ahead a little bit in suggesting that it lies in something beyond the created order, which, as Thomas Aquinas sometimes says, and this is what we call God. But let's approach this another way. Those who think that happiness lies in wealth think that happiness is something that we pile up and accumulate. Those who think that happiness lies in pleasure think happiness is a feeling, is something we feel, it's a sensation. Thomas Aquinas says it isn't either of those two things. Happiness is an activity. It is something that we're doing, something that we're involved in. That's an interesting idea, and it's an old idea, but we're not used to it in our day. We're so full of the hedonism, and it takes a little time to wrap the mind around it, that happiness is something we're doing. Not something that we accumulate, not something we feel, but something that we do. Well, what kind of thing that we're doing is it? What are we doing when we're happy? What activity is it? Thomas Aquinas says, if it fulfills our nature, then it must be the highest activity of our highest power. Now, what would you say is would you say that the power to eat is our highest power? I don't think so. Would you say that the power to feel stuff is our highest power? I don't think so. It looks like the intellectual powers are higher than these. Would you say that the power to decide, should I cross the street right now or to make practical decisions is our highest power? It's getting pretty high, but there is a higher one. Thomas Aquinas, it's another intellectual power. Thomas Aquinas says, it's to know the truth. It's to be involved in the knowledge of the truth. It's the activity of knowing. It's the activity of knowing how things are and trying to conform ourselves to that. How are things? What is the reality of things? You know, he says in another place, it's kind of interesting, he says, we rational beings, one of the things that distinguishes us from we're animals, okay, we're not angels, disembodied intellects, but we are rational animals. We cannot be fulfilled apart from seeking and possessing the truth, especially the highest truth. This is the highest activity, the highest power is to knowledge, but what is the highest activity of that highest power? It's knowing the highest truth, which is the truth about God. And ultimately, it isn't just the truth about him, like you could read stuff in a book about God. It's the not just knowing about God, but it's knowing God. Now, St. Paul speaks of this. He says, now, St. Paul doesn't claim to know God that way. He says, now I see in a glass darkly. But then I will see face to face. I will know as I am known. There will be no need for faith anymore. It will be replaced by knowledge. Why can't we have that here? In this life, everything that we know, is an inference from sense data, and we can't sense God. Our natural intellectual powers are not made that way. Maybe those of the angels are made like something like that, but ours aren't. They're connected with our body. And so God would have to supernaturally elevate our intellectual powers in order to know not just about him, which we can do in this life, but to know him. Now, St. Paul says, and this is a matter of faith, that will happen for the redeemed. But Thomas Aquinas also is able to reason that it's not just a matter of faith. It is reasonable to believe that this matter of faith is true. Because again, otherwise, this longing of ours would be in vain. Nothing else in our nature is in vain. Why should this be in vain? We're not speaking here of blackboard knowledge. We're speaking of that intellectual vision of which St. Paul spoke when he longingly wrote about seeing God. Sometimes, we scoff in the idea that ultimate fulfillment lies in wisdom and the activity of knowing because we're thinking of lower kinds of knowing. I read something by Carl Sagan in which he thought, well, the ultimate happiness is knowing physics, okay, and where did the universe come from, and I want to know all about the Big Bang and things like that. But a physicist might be desperately unhappy, a mathematician might be desperately unhappy. But that portion of happiness that we attain, the portion of happiness that we attain by knowing such things is real. There is a satisfaction in that kind of knowledge, but it's incomplete. It's worth pursuing in itself, but it's not enough. One of the interesting things is it's pursuing the knowledge of something that is beyond us, but it isn't above us. I mean, after all, you may know all about the Big Bang, but do you know you are a greater thing than the Big Bang was? You are an eternal soul. The Big Bang isn't. It's just a bunch of particles, okay? You are a bigger object of knowledge than that is. Our mind reaches for the knowledge of that which is above us and which is not found in the cosmos or in anything like that or in political science. It's found in God. What if we could reach what is beyond us? What if we could know the highest truth? What if we could know the uncreated truth in which all created truth has its origin and is born? The uncreated good in which all created good has its source. What if we could know that? That would be utter and perfect happiness. And we long for it, and because nature makes nothing in vain, we must be made for it. To say that we're made for the vision of God doesn't mean that we can attain it by our natural powers. We need divine grace. It doesn't mean that we'll attain it completely in this life. We won't. But it does mean we can accept the grace when it is offered to us, and we can trust the promise. Now, why are we attracted then? If all this is true, I mean, this seems pretty straightforward. Why are we attracted to the things in which happiness is commonly thought to lie but doesn't? Why do we make the mistake of thinking happiness lies in wealth, happiness lies in this, happiness lies in that? How is it even possible to think that it lies in mere pleasure or in power or honor or fame? Well, because all of these things, this is an insight from St. Augustine that St. Thomas echoes, all of these things dimly resemble the joy, the self-sufficiency, the omnipotence of the kingship of God and the worship given to him. When you think about it, we can imagine falsely that our supreme happiness will lie in pleasure, because pleasure is a sort of a dim echo on the ear of the mind of the supreme joy that would lie in God. We can imagine that it lies in power, because being able to do things is like a dim echo or image to us of God's omnipotence. We can imagine that it lies in honor and fame, because he supremely deserves what honor and worship that we can give him. St. Augustine wrote in his Confessions that ambition, human ambition, seeks glory, but only God is glorious forever. He said the caresses by which lustful people seduce each other are a search for love, but nothing is more caressing than his charity. We curiously desire knowledge, but he alone knows all things. And the ultimate source of our knowledge and purpose of our knowledge lies in him. We view luxury as abundance and completeness. We think, yeah, that's it. If only I had so much that the first canticle, the Inferno, one of the circles of hell is the hoarders and the wasters. There were people there was a fashionable way of life among the wealthy and the noble of his day, where they wasted things on a grand scale. They gave vast feasts just to lose this stuff, just to waste it. How could anybody even think that happiness might lie in that? Because wastefulness is a parody of generosity, which is a dim reflection of God, who is the infinitely generous giver of all good. So all of these false rabbit trails can seem to us falsely like more than rabbit trails, because they echo something that is true, but that is only in God. St. Thomas's point is that when we see God, we have all of that. Instead of the shadows of the good, the reflections of the good, the rabbit trails that resemble the good, we will have the good, and I won't say the good itself, the good himself in person. Now, this is important. I hear people say this all the time. You may have said this to yourself a time or two, or many times. You may say, I love God. I go to Mass. I pray. I say the Rosary. I'm serious about my penitential discipline in this season of Lent. I try to live a life of obedience. I love him. Why am I unfulfilled? If my happiness lies in God, why am I unfulfilled? The reason is, this is not heaven. We do not fully possess him yet. If I expect complete fulfillment in this life, I will always be barking up the wrong tree. And so the sense that there is something more, a longing. We are, after all, in exile in this life. It's a constant New Testament theme. If we didn't feel that longing, there would be something wrong with us. And we should rejoice that we have that longing, rather than mourning and thinking, oh, woe is me, everything is hopeless. It's a sign of hope. If we were merely evolved dirt, we would not long for something we know not what, and wonder what it is. Okay? We wouldn't. This is a sign of our eternal destiny. It's something that we can rejoice in. You know, have you ever felt that solemn joy in singing what, after all, is an extremely mournful song in Advent? We sing about the city that, the land that lays in solemn stillness here, and longing for the bridegroom to come. It's very sad. And yet there's a sort of a joy in thinking about this sadness, because the sadness itself is like the emblem on our hearts of a longing for something which we have been promised will be fulfilled. If I try to seek complete fulfillment in this life, I'll always be barking up the wrong tree. I'll inevitably be falling out of it and getting hurt. I will inevitably start recoiling and thinking, well, maybe that didn't work, let me just drink. That didn't work, let me try other women. That didn't work, let me just make a pile of money. But we can keep our eyes on the goal, and we can prepare in this life for the complete fulfillment in the next. And wonder of wonders, it actually transforms the enjoyment of even the goods of this life. I mean, after all, I love my wife dearly. She is not God and cannot be my ultimate fulfillment. But I have a glimpse of that ultimate fulfillment in loving her for the sake of God. I can love my friends for the sake of God. I can pursue my discipline and seek knowledge. Well, a lot of it might be book knowledge, which has very limited value in itself, but if I seek it for the sake of God, that transforms it. It takes it up into something else. I can love my grandchildren for the sake of God. I can St. Paul, I think it was St. Paul at one point speaking to servants says, you can do this for Christ. You can sweep the floor for God. This transforms even the fragmentary and limited happiness of this life, because now, in everything that I do, since I'm doing it for the sake of God, I can enjoy more of those glimpses, those flashes of Him. And we've all experienced those glimpses and flashes of Him who will one day show Himself to us in His entirety, in all of His glory, in all of His light. He has promised, then will I be fulfilled, then will there be nothing left to desire. Thank you.
Give this lesson or talk about what true happiness is in the college classroom without bringing faith and theology into the discussion, or do you?
Well, in some ways you can't, and in some ways you can. Mm-hmm. I must not use my teacher's, what is this thing called? Podium, rostrum, something like that. I may not use it as a pulpit. Mm-hmm. I'm teaching. But on the other hand, one of the things that I ought to be teaching it helps for me, because what I teach is ethical philosophy and political philosophy, and I'm teaching the riches of the Western tradition. Well, the Western tradition includes Christianity. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I can teach Thomas Aquinas, for instance. And it's entirely appropriate and in no way the same as teaching to say, this is what he says about God. This is what he says about the relationship between faith and reason and so forth. And I tell you, if I don't bring it up, my students do anyway. Okay. My students do anyway. They, some of them will get really angry. I was teaching about natural law one semester, and somebody said, isn't this really all just about religion? And you know, you want to say, well, where did you learn that the source of an insight is an argument against it? That's a logical fallacy. But there's this sort of prejudice against it. Atheism is very big now. You know, and it's funny because there's never been a time in history when it was big like that, where there was a cultural mood. Atheists were always small minorities and detested by everybody else, and why are there so many atheists now? I think a large part of this, it started with the young men. And I think a large part of it is because so many of these young men have been growing up without their dads. And if you couldn't count on your father, it's awfully hard to learn to count on our Heavenly Father, the one in whose name all earthly fathers are called. You know, and that's tough. So some people will get angry, but for other people, it's like a drink of water, and it's just the material. If they ask you, well, how did you come to believe this? You said that you used to be an atheist. I can answer it. I can do it. I just can't drop things on them and say, oh, have you? I knew a guy who he was an engineer, and he would take time out in his engineering class and say, let me tell you the 4 spiritual laws, and try to convert them and lead them to Christ. You know, and that I can't do that. That would be dishonest. It's not what I'm being paid to do. But just by doing my job, the opportunity inevitably arises.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you then feel pressure, either overt or covert, to teach critiques of Aquinas as a way to be fair in the classroom, or do you feel like you were able to just present the best argument as you see it?
Well, what I always did, even when I was still an atheist, was that I would present the best argument that I could present for what I was teaching, and I would especially try to present a convincing argument if it was a minority opinion. This is a minority opinion. And so, you know, even back when I didn't believe it, I tried to present the best argument for it. I can still do that. One of the things I spend a lot of time teaching is natural law. I tell my students sometimes when I'm teaching natural law, I said, look, if all of your professors believed in natural law, I believe in it too, but I would still give you a lot of arguments against. But hardly any of them do, okay? So I'm the equal time. I'm like the FAA equal time doctrine. And so you're getting the counter arguments from them all the time, not necessarily well-informed counter arguments. But I don't have to do that because you're already getting it. You're soaked in implicit critique in it. I can just tell you why an intelligent person might believe in it.
Curious about I don't know if you have a 5-minute version of natural law topic. I imagine not. I'm sure it's a whole semester of materials.
You would like a brief explanation of what natural law is?
Well, I think I know the definition, but when you're saying that people are disagreeing and what, I guess I'm trying to understand what the.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, one way I like to put it is this. You know, there are some things that we can't not know. It's impossible not to know them. That's not the whole of the natural law, but that's at the root of it. Now, some of the things that we can't not know have to do not with how we should live, but just with how things are. Like, a thing can't both be and not be in the same sense at the same time. You can't not know that. I mean, you may never have thought of it, but even a kid, for instance, you have two kids quarreling during the school day, and one of them says, teacher said close the door. Close the door, you left it open. I did not. You did too. I did not. You did too. They're both assuming that either it's open or it's closed, and it can't be both in the same sense at the same time. They know the principle of non-contradiction, right? The first principles of the natural law, the starting points of the natural law, the moral basics are also things that you can't not know. They're built into what I like to call deep conscience. Thomas Aquinas called it synderesis. That's a Greek word, but that doesn't matter. We say, oh, but you only know these things because you were taught. If you didn't already know something, you couldn't even be taught more about right and wrong. You know, if somebody, does a child believe the golden rule just because he's been told it? No, if he couldn't see for himself that it is true, then when he was told it, he would think, wow, that's like 2 + 2 is 5. Right? It's just like when you teach somebody 2 + 2 is 4, the kid may not get it at first, but you say, well, look, here's how many is here, 1, 2, how many is here, 1, 2, put them together, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh yeah, 2 + 2 is 4. He sees it for himself. He can see for himself that that you ought to do to others as you would have them do to yourself. So that when mom says, this is not a little philosopher we're talking about here, you know, but when mom says, don't pull your sister's hair, how would you like it if she pulled your hair? He might make excuses. He might still want to pull her hair, but he feels kind of sheepish because that does make sense. Okay? If we didn't already know these things, we couldn't even learn other things about them. And these first principles, along with the other knowledge that can be built on them, with some help like reflecting on the design of our nature, what things are for. You know, this is the natural law. And this is why St. Paul said that it's written on the heart. Okay? And when I say by reflecting on our design, I'll give you an example of what I mean. We know that some things about our design are just biological. The heart is for pumping blood. But some of this stuff has moral implications too. You know that the lungs are for oxygenating the blood, not for getting high by sniffing glue. That implies something about how we should live. What is the purpose of anger? Why would we even have such a power? Well, for the sake of arousing us to the ordinate defense of endangered goods. Okay? Why do we have sexual powers at all? I mean, even a mere biologist knows, for the sake of turning the wheel of the generations. He probably wouldn't put it that way. But for procreation and for the unity of the two procreative partners. So whatever undermines or thwarts those purposes is a wrong way of using those powers. You know, so we can build on the stuff that you can't not know by reflecting on these other kinds of matters too. And that's why it's called natural law, because it's built into our nature in that sense. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you for using children examples, because it seems like it's an easy way to bring in like natural consequences that happen.
Yeah.
To actually demonstrate.
Natural consequences are another reason why we call the natural law natural. It's not the only one. Sometimes people try to reduce everything to consequences, and there's even a moral theory that thinks results are all that matters. It's called consequentialism. But according to natural law, consequences matter, but they're not the only thing that matters. There are some things, for instance, that must not be done even for the sake of a good result. You shouldn't murder even if you could save some people you shouldn't deliberately take innocent human life, even if by doing so you could save some other people. You know, you shouldn't rape the enemy population, even if it might bring about peace and settle the insurrection. You know, the Romans didn't seem to get that, so it's more than consequences, but there are natural consequences. Sometimes people say, well, I see that there are consequences for breaking the human law. I might have to go to jail, pay a fine. What are the natural consequences? But there are tons of them. I cut my wrist, I'm going to bleed, I'm going to have pain, I might die. I use dope, I become its slave. I betray my friends, pretty soon I'm not going to have friends. I jump from bed to bed to bed, I am eventually going to lose the very capacity for intimacy. I tell myself lies. One of the natural consequences of that is that in order to cover up having told lies to myself, I'm going to have to tell myself other lies. And I'm going to have to tell other lies to cover those up. And pretty soon I will be telling myself so many lies that I won't know whether I'm coming or going. And even my ability to pursue the truth is going to be drastically impaired. So there are physical and biological natural consequences. There are social natural consequences, even natural consequences having to do with the structure of knowledge. And that's important stuff, yeah. Thank you. I'm glad you brought that out. Yes, sir.
Does Does Thomas's theory or understanding of happiness and fulfillment consider human development? So, as you're describing the different ideas of fulfillment and various opinions on I was just like seeing, oh, that's where my kid's at right now, like they think, so I'm wondering, like, has Thomas or anybody else like considered or integrated human development into
Yeah, I'm assuming that by human development you mean the way that we grow and mature and acquire the virtues and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. As a matter of fact, although I've put my emphasis today on ultimate complete happiness, he does say that there is an incomplete thing in this life that we call happiness, and that pretty much is, well, yes, you need some of these ordinary goods, but you also need to develop the virtues so that you can use them properly. Okay? You need to develop courage. You need to develop temperance so that you know when it's licit to enjoy a pleasure and when not. You need to, and you have the discipline to do that. You need to develop practical wisdom. You need to develop justice so that you give to other people what they deserve and not do unto them as they don't deserve. And you need the spiritual virtues too. You need faith, hope, and charity. And these are matters of slow development. Now there's a difference with the ordinary, this worldly, cardinal virtues like justice and temperance and so forth. Thomas Aquinas calls those the acquired virtues. I mean, all virtues have to be acquired, but he calls them the acquired virtues because they can be acquired by your own powers. You habituate yourself. You keep doing the thing that you know you ought to do but that frightens you over and over, and eventually it becomes second nature, and you're beginning to become a person of fortitude, a person of courage, right? You resist, you even though it's hard, you resist that 8th piece of chocolate cake. And the next time maybe you're a little stronger and you can resist the 7th piece. And eventually you're only having a dessert if it's really okay to have a dessert. You're acquiring temperance. You build it up. He says, on the other hand, that the spiritual virtues they're not acquired in that way. You can't just work yourself up to them. They require the grace of God. But the human will is not passive in this, because we have to cooperate with that grace. We have to say yes to it. We have to habitually receive it and accept it and not fight against it. And so, he's as a matter of fact, in the Summa, he talks more about the virtues and about the development of the virtues, what you're calling human development, than about anything else. It occupies, the Summa is divided into the first part, the first part of the second part, the second part of the second part, I love it, the third part, in the supplement, and a huge parts of the first part of the second part and the second part of the second part are all about the virtues. Somebody murmured, was that a signal for a question? No? When my students go like this or scratch their heads or flip their pencils, I think that they want to ask a question. I'm like an auctioneer, Guy pulls his ear and I think he's making a bid. Hello. So, any other? Yes.
I'm not sure I entirely grasped. You said happiness is an activity, something we are doing, and that Aquinas says the activity of knowing how things are. Could you expand on
Okay,
that as
okay.
happiness as an activity?
Happiness is an activity. By contrast with just something passive like feeling something. It's something that we're doing. Now, if it is an activity, then the question arises, well, what activity is it? Since what we're talking about is an activity that fulfills us, well, what fulfills us is the actualization of our natural potentialities. Now, I need to come back to that in a minute, because there's a catch in that. There's a sort of a trick there about our natural potentialities, but I'll come back to it. Now, so what potentialities are we talking about? We're talking about the use of our powers. It would involve the activity of using our natural powers, bringing them into actualizing them. And it looks like the higher forms of happiness lie in the actualization of higher powers. Our highest powers are our intellectual powers. Of our intellectual powers, the highest intellectual power is not just practical reasoning, what should I do, but it's theoretical reasoning, as he calls it. It doesn't mean like working out theories of physics or something, but it means knowing how things are, including the truth about God. That's the highest activity, that knowledge of our highest power, of our rational power. And that's what our happiness would lie in. There were some other people, even in the Middle Ages, who thought, well, knowing God, yes, that'll be, or being with God, that'll be supreme happiness. But and it's a union with God, yes, I agree with Thomas Aquinas like that. But they said, but it's about feelings. It's an affective union, okay? And Thomas says, well, of course you've got some feelings. All of that is going to be spilling over. Even your happiness is even going to be spilling over. Overflowing, he literally says, from your soul into your body. You know, you'll feel good when you know God, but it's the mind that is doing that, because that's the highest, most characteristically human part of us. Does that help? Mm-hmm. Okay, when I said the trick about natural potentiality is this. The potentiality to form a friend is natural in two ways. I long for friendship, and I actually can, by my own powers, make friends and exercise friendship. Knowing God, wanting to know God, though, is natural in one of those ways, but not the other. I have Godward longing, that's natural to me. But unlike I can make a friend through my own powers, I can't see God as he is in his own being with my own natural powers. I'm going to need his grace, supernaturally uplifting my whole soul to the vision of God in the next life. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So there is a difference there. He calls this this is a potentiality that we have, but it's a different kind. He calls it an obediential potentiality, which is kind of a misleading term. I like to think of it like this. A dock is naturally made to receive the ship, but it can't provide the ship for itself. The ship has to sail into the dock. So in one way, it's natural to the dock to have a ship, but in another way, it's not. It can't just say ship. Okay, there it is, you know. And so this Godward longing, you know, this is like that dockiness in us. We have this natural Godward longing, but we can't just. C.S. Lewis said something interesting about this. He says people think of religion as reaching up to God. Well, he's infinitely up there. That's not going to get you anywhere. That's just religious philosophy or something. What our faith is the confidence in a God who reaches down to us and grasps us and pulls us up. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned earlier about, how virtue is a component to happiness, or happiness can be derived from being virtuous, but it's not essential. And then the concept of learned virtues, and that you have to learn. There are virtues that are intrinsic, and then there are virtues that are you have to be taught the virtues. But it's pretty clear that people can be taught false virtues that do not necessarily derive from the natural law, and they can derive happiness from those virtues as well. What is the difference between the happiness derived from real virtue and false virtue? Is there a difference?
Well, I would say that you can't actually derive happiness from a quality of character that is not a real virtue. But maybe we're talking past each other. I may be misunderstanding you. Give me an example of what you're calling a false virtue.
So, for example, take tolerance, for example.
Oh, okay. Well, I would say that tolerance it's not on Thomas Aquinas' list of the virtues, but I would say that it is a department of some of some of the other virtues. It partakes of the virtue of patience. He's chewing his gum in the movie theater and I don't smash him in the nose, okay? I tolerate him. It partakes of practical wisdom. I know that some things should not be tolerated and some things should be tolerated. And I have to have an understanding of that. So what we call tolerance, I wouldn't say it's a single virtue, but I'd say it is a good practice which, properly understood, doesn't mean tolerating everything or trying to be morally neutral or just saying blandly live and let live, hey, everything goes. But it actually means making judgments. Oftentimes people think that tolerance is suspending judgment, but you know, in order to be tolerant in the right way, you're gonna have to know what can be tolerated. You don't tolerate murder, and what can't be tolerated. And so actually it doesn't take you off the hook of judgment, it puts you on the hook of judgment. And in order to make those judgments right, you're gonna have to have all the rest of the virtues.
So the idea being that deriving happiness from a false or incomplete virtue is actually, unbeknownst to you, deriving happiness from the virtues that it extends from or parodies?
Well, if somebody is practicing tolerance properly, then I think that he's deriving happiness from the correct exercise of all those virtues that it participates in. If he has a false understanding of tolerance, he might be, for instance, he might be getting pleasure, which is not the same as happiness, although it's related to it, by patting himself on the back, for instance, and saying, well, I'm a virtuous person, or looking around and saying, people approve of me because I tolerated that, okay, and he basks in their approval, but that's not really complete happiness, okay? There are a couple of other things that I might, that's the main thing. There are a couple of other things like,
I guess the idea being that if, in this life, if you cannot achieve real happiness anyway, how do you tell the difference between I'm confusing this pleasure or this approval with happiness, and I'm actually deriving happiness from some good?
You can, in this life, have something which is worth having in itself. It is, to be sure, fragmentary and incomplete, and it is not that happiness which leaves nothing to be desired, which we will only have in the next life. But it is worth having in itself. It does participate in that happiness. It shares in that more ultimate happiness. It is not totally unrelated to it. It's akin to it. And that's what we call happiness in this life, and you can certainly have that. And that's how, and otherwise we wouldn't be able to talk about this at all. We wouldn't understand anything about the subject. Okay? All right. Anybody else?
Could you talk about the role of friendship in happiness?
Yes. Thomas Aquinas is almost scandalizing at one point. He on the one hand, he really argues strongly that friendship is a precious and a wonderful good. Okay? It's one of the chief ways in which we exercise virtue. He agrees with Aristotle that there are, Aristotle's a pretty smart guy. He was a pagan, but he understood a lot of things. That there is a sort of a partial, incomplete, shabby thing that we call friendship, which is merely based on enjoying the same pleasures together. We like to go to the movies or something. We like to have a bottle of beer. There's a kind of an incomplete friendship that is based on usefulness, mutual usefulness, like business partners. But real friendship, of which these things are shadows, he says, is partnership in a good life. Partnership in a good life. And the friends encourage each other to become better persons. If you don't have that partnership, if your so-called friendship is making you worse and making the other guy worse too. So this is really important. And he says that friends love each other, and he gives a tremendous analysis of this love. He gives some of the most beautiful analyses of what's going on in marital love, which most people don't think he does, but he does, anywhere in the literature. Now, the point where he scandalizes you a little bit is, yes, at a certain point, do you need friends for the happiness of the next life? And he says, well, you will have friends in the next life, but God is completely sufficient, and you wouldn't actually need them. And it, you sort of think, well, of course you need them. But no, if it's really true that we find everything in God, you wouldn't need them, but you'll have them anyway. You get all this overabundance of stuff, and I'm not sure if I'm answering the question that was behind your question, am I?
Yeah, I was just thinking about where he talks about the necessity of friends for happiness in this life, I guess, because you have to be able to.
Yeah, we have to have friends. We sometimes, this is often misunderstood, this is a natural law point. We're naturally social. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that we're like cows? They're naturally social, they hang around in herds? Well, no, it doesn't. I mean, you could say that a cow is naturally social in one sense of the term, or that a bee is naturally social in one sense of the term. But we're naturally social in another sense, right? The bee has instincts that make it hang around with other bees. The cow has instincts that make it hang around with other cows. But the critical thing to understand about us is not our instincts, if we have any, but that we cannot have a complete and flourishing life except by sharing it with other people. People say, well, what is the good life? Well, the funny thing about human beings is they can't even enjoy the good life unless they are able to share it with others. Okay, friends. And there's a lot of different kinds of friendship. That's what it means. It also, in our case, another difference between us and the cows, cow society, quote unquote society, is dumb. They have a community of, I guess, maybe warmth, a community of just sort of feeling like there's another cow around me, feeling safe because there are, it protects them from predators to be in a herd. But for us, our form of society is connected with our rationality. Our partnership with each other in a good life is connected with knowledge. When we know, we want to shape our life according to that knowledge. And we want to share that knowledge with other people. And we need their help in order to attain that knowledge. And friends are necessary for all of that, not just necessary because I might get sick and need somebody to take care of me. Although that is true, one of the things about us is that we are vulnerable, and not just because I might be hungry and need food, or I might be hard on my luck and need a loan. But because one of the ways in which we're vulnerable and needy is that we can't attain the knowledge of all the things that we need to know without each other. And we've all known that since we were small. Our mommies and daddies taught us something about generosity and about playing fair and about justice and about loving God. And so this is not just something for scholars and scientists who are engaged in a cooperative friendship or partnership in attaining knowledge. This is something that we're all doing. And so at so many levels, at every dimension of our being, we're involved in friendship, and it's necessary. In God, charity transforms this. Charity is not just like, divine love is not just like another virtue alongside the other virtues, it changes them. I might have erotic love for my wife. I might have the companionable friendship with my wife. These are natural loves. But if I love God, it transforms all of those other things because I love her for the sake of God. It transforms companionship, it transforms eros, it transforms everything. You might say, well, shouldn't I love her for her own sake instead of for the sake of God? Loving her for the sake of God isn't loving her as well. It's loving her better. Because a child of God is what she is. The image of God is what she is. If I'm loving her for the sake of God, I'm loving her in the way that most accurately corresponds to the very thing that she is. And in connection with the one who loves her more than I ever could. Does that help? Okay.
Thank you.